The setting is a postcard-perfect paradise. Crystal clear waters, secluded beaches, and an atmosphere that seems to erase all problems. It's the kind of place anyone would call the ultimate escape. But for one young American searching for a fresh start, that paradise would soon reveal its darkest side. In 2011, Yvonne Baldelli, a woman full of plans and hope for rebuilding her life, left California for a small island in Panama. By her side was her boyfriend, Brian Brimager, a former Marine who seemed to offer not just companionship, but also the promise of a new beginning, far from the frustrations and disappointments of the past. On the surface, it looked like a romantic story, a couple leaving everything behind to live a tropical dream. But reality behind the curtain was very different. Within weeks, the relationship that once appeared passionate began to unravel into arguments, control, and a silent pattern of abuse. Months later, Yvonne simply vanished, as if the island itself had swallowed her whole. Brian, on the other hand, returned to the United States alone, carrying vague explanations, suspicious emails, and half-told stories that only deepened the mystery. Yvonne's disappearance exposed not only a brutal crime, but also a carefully constructed web of lies. A web that revealed Brian's darkest side and shattered the illusion of paradise that surrounded Devil's Island. Today, you're going to hear every detail of the story. Who Yvonne really was, how her relationship with Brian spiraled out of control, what truly happened on that island, and how investigators finally uncovered the truth. You are watching Dr. Investigation. And before we dive deeper into this case, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Here, you'll find real stories that prove how the darkest side of human nature can hide even in the most beautiful places on Earth. Before vanishing mysteriously in Panama, Yvonne Baldelli was a woman like so many others, full of energy, creativity, and a determination to give her life a new direction. She grew up in California, raised in a close-knit family, known as a caring daughter, a beloved sister, and a loyal friend always ready to support those around her. Yvonne had a special passion for fashion. Sewing, designing clothes, reinventing pieces, that was her world. After years of working in jobs that never truly fulfilled her, she dreamed of turning that talent into her livelihood. For her, moving to a paradise wasn't just a romantic adventure. It was a chance to start over, far from the suffocating routine and old disappointments of the past. Her love life, however, had not been easy. Past relationships left emotional scars, and Yvonne longed for someone who could offer her stability and true companionship. It was during this moment of vulnerability and hope that she became involved with Brian Brimager, the former Marine who seemed to have all the answers to her desires. He appeared strong, disciplined, and protective, the figure she believed could lead her into the new chapter she had been searching for. When Brian convinced her to move to the Panamanian island of Bocas del Toro, Yvonne saw it as the beginning of a whole new life. It wasn't just a change of address, but a fulfillment of a personal project. To create a life of peace, love, and creativity in one of the most beautiful places in the world. But behind the excitement and the image of an adventurous couple, there were warning signs that few noticed. Subtle arguments, flashes of jealousy, and small controlling behaviors that, on their own, might have seemed ordinary, but together painted a troubling picture of their relationship. Yvonne believed she was escaping old frustrations and stepping into a promising future. What she didn't know was that by chasing a tropical dream, she was walking straight toward the greatest danger of her life. When Yvonne and Brian arrived in Bocas del Toro, it seemed their plan was finally coming to life. The Panamanian archipelago, with its turquoise waters and slow-paced lifestyle, looked like the perfect setting for the fresh start Yvonne had longed for. To the locals, the couple stood out. Two Americans chasing a simpler life, trading California's comfort for a modest beachside cabin. At first, everything seemed idyllic. Yvonne threw herself into her sewing projects, dreaming of selling handmade pieces to tourists passing through the island. Brian, on the other hand, talked about reinventing himself as a musician, playing in bars and small local events. They looked like the picture of adventurous expats, building a new life away from the pressures and expectations of the outside world. But soon, cracks began to show behind the facade. Locals recalled heated arguments, their voices leaking through the thin walls of the house they shared. Brian's tone was always commanding, laced with impatience and control, while Yvonne tried to keep the peace, masking the growing tension. Life on the island, meant to be peaceful, became a form of isolation, far from family and friends. Yvonne had no one to confide in. That distance worked to Brian's advantage, giving him room to tighten his control, limiting decisions, influencing her every step, and creating a constant atmosphere of surveillance. Small incidents started piling up. Cut-off messages, bursts of jealousy, financial restrictions. Each detail, seemingly minor, painted a troubling picture of a relationship turning into an emotional prison. To neighbors, Yvonne still smiled, but behind the smile were signs of fear and exhaustion. What was supposed to be a new life in a Caribbean paradise had turned into a routine of tension and manipulation. The dream of starting over was unraveling fast, and Yvonne, more isolated than ever, couldn't see she was trapped in a deadly spiral, one for which escape would be almost impossible. Life in Bocas del Toro moved to an increasingly tense rhythm. Neighbors noticed the couple's arguments becoming more frequent. What had once been muffled disputes were now a routine, revealing just how much the relationship was deteriorating. Then, suddenly, Yvonne was gone. Friends who often saw her around the island found her sudden absence alarming. She used to spend time at local bars, chat with residents, and proudly share the clothes she crafted. Her disappearance wasn't gradual. It was as if she had been erased overnight. Brian, meanwhile, began acting in ways that raised even more suspicion. Shortly after Yvonne vanished, he packed his bags and returned to the United States alone. To Yvonne's family, he offered a confusing explanation. He claimed she had decided to travel to Costa Rica with another man and no longer wanted contact. But nothing about his story added up. Yvonne had never mentioned plans to leave the island. She was in constant communication with her family, especially her sister, sending messages, photos, and phone calls. And then, all of a sudden, everything stopped. The silence was the first red flag. Days passed with no word from Yvonne, and her family's worry turned into dread. To make matters worse, emails began arriving, supposedly written by her. But the tone was wrong. Cold, robotic, completely different from her usual way of writing. At the same time, Brian clung to his story, yet every detail exposed contradictions. He seemed more focused on explaining his own movements than on helping to find Yvonne. The ex-Marine, once seen as reliable and protective, now looked surrounded by half-truths and poorly woven lies. For Yvonne's family, doubt quickly hardened into certainty. She had not left on her own. Something terrible had happened on the so-called Devil's Island, and the man who was supposed to protect her seemed to be the prime suspect in her disappearance. When days of silence stretched into weeks, the Baldelli family knew they could no longer wait. Yvonne was not the kind of person to vanish without explanation. She called. She sent photos. She shared even the simplest details of her daily life. The sudden void was a clear sign that something terrible had happened. Her sister, Michelle Valenzuela, refused to accept Brian's vague excuses. While he insisted that Yvonne had gone off to Costa Rica with another man, Michelle knew his words were nothing but a smokescreen. Determined, she launched a crusade of her own, contacting authorities, mobilizing resources, and traveling to Panama herself in search of answers. That was when the romantic image of life in the Caribbean began to unravel. The cabin where Yvonne had lived with Brian did not feel like a home casually abandoned. On the contrary, inside were folded clothes, handbags, and personal belongings Yvonne would never have left behind if she had chosen to leave. Every corner of the house felt frozen in time, as if life had been abruptly interrupted. Under pressure from the family and growing media attention, Panamanian authorities finally took action, supported by the FBI. The process was slow but meticulous. Local witnesses reported violent arguments at the house, describing muffled screams cutting to the night air, followed by an eerie silence. This pattern repeated itself until night Yvonne was last seen, when the silence became permanent. The suspicions deepened further when investigators examined the emails supposedly sent by Yvonne after her disappearance. The digital trail revealed something shocking. Those messages had not been sent from Panama, but from computers in the United States, precisely where Brian had returned shortly afterward. The deception was exposed. Inside the cabin, the findings were even more disturbing. Forensic tests detected traces of human blood in key areas, stains invisible to the naked eye but undeniable under scientific analysis. To investigators, there was no doubt anymore. The house had been a crime scene. Every piece of evidence, the reported fights, the sudden silence, the abandoned belongings, the falsified emails, the blood discovered, pointed in the same direction. This was not the story of a woman who had chosen to move on. This was a crime, and the prime suspect had a name and a face: Brian Brimager. The investigation not only dismantled Brian's version of events, but also revealed his chilling detachment. While Yvonne's family was consumed by despair, he carried on with his life in the United States as if nothing had happened. But the evidence was closing in, piece by piece, transforming a mystery into a criminal case that could no longer be ignored. The investigation, which until then had been built on clues and contradictions, took a definitive turn when the worst was confirmed. Months after Yvonne's disappearance, in a swampy, overgrown area not far from the cabin where the couple had lived, locals stumbled upon partially buried plastic bags. What lay inside would change the case forever. Authorities were called immediately, and what had once been only suspicion was now a crime scene. Inside the bags were human remains in an advanced state of decomposition. The site radiated neglect and brutality, clear signs that someone had tried to erase the traces of a heinous crime. The material was sent for forensic analysis. The results confirmed what Yvonne's family had feared all along. The remains belonged to her. The confirmation was devastating, yet it also brought an undeniable truth. Yvonne had not run away, had not left by choice. She had been murdered. The way the remains were found revealed the killer's chilling detachment. The body had been dismembered, stuffed into plastic bags, discarded as though it were garbage. It was an act of dehumanization that demonstrated not only violence, but also premeditation, and a calculated attempt to conceal the crime. For investigators, the discovery erased all doubt. The circle was closing in on Brian Brimager. Every piece of evidence, the blood in the house, the falsified emails, his cold behavior, and now the physical proof of Yvonne's death, pointed directly to him. For the Baldelli family, the confirmation brought both unbearable pain and cruel relief. The pain of knowing Yvonne had been brutally murdered, and the relief of finally having an answer after months of agonizing uncertainty. There was no longer any way for Brian to escape the weight of the truth. From that moment on, the case was no longer about a missing woman. It was officially a homicide investigation. The so-called Devil's Island had revealed its darkest side, and the paradise Yvonne once dreamed of calling home had become the stage for one of the most brutal crimes ever recorded in the Panamanian Caribbean. As the evidence piled up against him, a new question arose. Who was Brian Brimager really? To Yvonne, he appeared to be a strong man, a former Marine who inspired trust and offered a sense of safety. But as the investigation advanced, another, much darker side began to surface. Brian had served in the United States Marine Corps, and that past gave him an aura of discipline and respect. For many, the uniform symbolized honor, courage, and protection. But in his personal life, the contrast was striking. Behind the image of a model soldier was a volatile man, prone to fits of anger, controlling behavior, and a history of abusive relationships. Documents and testimonies revealed that Brian had shown violence before. Ex-girlfriends recounted episodes of both physical and psychological abuse, describing him as someone who could be charming at first, but over time revealed an explosive and dangerous side. It was a pattern: win someone over, dominate them, and eventually destroy them emotionally. It also came to light that Brian was living a double life. While in Panama with Yvonne, he maintained contact with the mother of his daughter back in the United States. Phone records and messages showed he was juggling two realities at once: an unstable relationship in the Caribbean and unfinished business at home. This duplicity not only shattered his image as a loyal partner, but also revealed his capacity to manipulate people and circumstances to maintain control. Brian's coldness after Yvonne's disappearance raised further suspicion. Instead of showing desperation or engaging in the search, he behaved as though nothing had happened. He returned to the U.S., carried on with his daily life, and attempted to move forward as if the woman he had shared intense months with had simply vanished. That absence of empathy became, in itself, psychological proof of his true nature. The profile drawn by investigators was clear. Brian Brimager was not the loving boyfriend Yvonne thought she had by her side. He was a man obsessed with control, unable to handle rejection, and willing to resort to extreme violence to preserve appearances. Unveiling this hidden side revealed that the crime was not an isolated act or a sudden fit of rage. It was the inevitable outcome of a dangerous behavioral pattern that Yvonne, tragically, only recognized when it was far too late. With the discovery of Yvonne's remains and the mounting evidence against Brian Brimager, the case entered a new stage, the pursuit of justice. It was no longer about investigating a disappearance or proving a murder. It was about holding the guilty accountable in a court of law. U.S. authorities brought charges primarily focused on fraud, destruction of evidence, and making false statements, while a homicide investigation continued in parallel. Brian was indicted for creating fake emails in Yvonne's name, a calculated attempt to deceive her family, mislead investigators, and conceal the crime. He was also accused of withholding information about her whereabouts and manipulating the narrative of the case. During trial, Brian's cold demeanor resurfaced. He denied responsibility, tried to shift the blame, and presented himself as a victim of misinterpreted circumstances. But the facts spoke louder than his words. Blood traces in the cabin, testimonies of domestic violence, emails traced back to the United States, and, above all, the discovery of Yvonne's remains. Each piece of evidence dismantled the story he had built. For prosecutors, the narrative was clear. Brian Brimager had killed Yvonne Baldelli, hidden her body, and attempted to disguise the crime with an elaborate web of lies. Though the case faced challenges due to distance and jurisdictional limits, the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Yvonne's family followed every step of proceedings with both grief and determination. They knew nothing could undo their loss, but they carried a mission that could not be abandoned: to ensure Brian was held accountable. In the end, Brian Brimager was convicted of fraud, obstruction of justice, and destruction of evidence, and sentenced to prison. While a formal conviction for a homicide was not achieved at that time, the verdict still marked a turning point, an acknowledgement of his direct role in the tragedy that ended Yvonne's life. For her family, the outcome brought mixed emotions: relief that Brian was behind bars, but also the painful reminder that Yvonne would never return. The case became a symbol of how violence can hide behind a mask of love, and how the relentless pursuit of justice can at least give voice to those who can no longer speak. The case of Yvonne Baldelli is not just about a complex investigation or the trial of a man who tried to cover up a crime. Above all, it is about a life cut short in the most brutal way. A woman full of dreams, seeking love, peace, and a chance to start over, instead found violence where she thought she had found safety. Yvonne was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, someone whose eyes carried the hope of turning her talent into a future, who had the courage to risk everything for a new life in a distant land. Her story reminds us that behind headlines and statistics are real people, with stories, smiles, and plans that should never have been destroyed. This case exposes a harsh truth. Domestic violence, often silent, can hide beneath gestures of affection, behind a mask of seemingly normal relationships. Yvonne overlooked the warning signs, as so many victims do, believing that love could change the course of the relationship. Tragically, that trust cost her life. By revisiting her story, we are not just recounting a crime. We are keeping alive the memory of a woman who deserves so much more, who deserved to live. At the same time, we raise an important flag. It is vital to speak about violence, to recognize the signs of control and abuse, and never to underestimate small gestures that could be the prelude to something far worse. For the Baldelli family, the pain will never fade. But Yvonne's legacy is the warning her story leaves to the world: that no dream should cost a life, and that silence around abuse could be fatal. If you've made it this far, take a moment to reflect. How many Yvonnes are still living in silence around us? How many stories like hers could be prevented if we pay attention, if we offer support, if we give a voice to those who are suffering? This was another episode of Dr. Investigation. If you believe stories like Yvonne's must be remembered and shared, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. By doing so, you help keep alive not only the memory of the victims, but also the fight for justice.